Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true disturbing stories from the frozen wilderness of Alberta. These are tales of people who ventured into the unforgiving winter landscape and encountered something that defied explanation. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. My uncle left me his hunting cabin outside of Nordegg when he died. I hadn't seen the place since I was maybe 12, and back then it seemed enormous. This perfect little sanctuary tucked between the pines with a wood stove that kept everything warm no matter how hard the wind blew outside. When the lawyer told me it was mine, I figured I'd drive up there in late January, check on the property, maybe spend a night or two before deciding whether to keep it or sell. Drive took longer than I remembered. Highway 11 was clear enough, but once I turned onto the forestry road, I was crawling through about 8 inches of fresh powder. My truck handled it fine. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. No tire tracks, no footprints. Just this corridor of white and gray that seemed to go on forever. I'd been putting off dealing with the cabin since October. My Uncle Garrett had been dead 4 months. Part of me felt guilty about that, like I should have made the trip sooner, should have been more involved. But Garrett and I hadn't been close in years. He'd gotten strange toward the end, stopped coming into town, stopped returning calls. My mom said he just wanted to be left alone. When I finally pulled up to the cabin around 3 in the afternoon, the light was already starting to fade. That's the thing about winter up here, daylight feels borrowed, like it's only visiting for a few hours before the dark takes over again. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered and older. The logs had weathered to this dark gray, and snow had drifted up against the north wall almost to the windows. I grabbed my gear from the truck beds, sleeping bag, cooler, box of supplies, and hauled everything inside. The door wasn't locked. I don't think Garrett ever locked it. The interior smelled like cold ash and something else, something faintly sour that I couldn't place. Dust covered everything. The wood stove sat in the corner exactly where it always had, and beside it was a neat stack of split logs. Someone had been here recently. I told myself Garrett must have stacked that wood before he died, maybe in the fall, but the logs were dry, not covered in that fine layer of dust that coated the table and chairs. And there was no dust on the floor in front of the stove either, like someone had been walking back and forth. The cabin was just 2 rooms, the main space with the stove and a kitchen counter, and a smaller bedroom in back. I dropped my stuff and started getting the fire going. The sun was nearly down by then, and the temperature inside couldn't have been much above freezing. My breath came out in clouds. I crumpled newspaper, arranged kindling, struck a match. The fire caught quickly, and within 20 minutes I had actual heat spreading through the room. That's when I noticed the marks on the wall. They were beside the window facing west, carved into the log, shallow scratches forming shapes I couldn't quite make sense of. Circles with lines radiating out, triangles stacked on top of each other. They looked deliberate, not random. I ran my fingers over them. The wood inside the grooves was lighter, newer. These were recent. I tried to remember if they'd been there when I was a kid. I didn't think so. But I'd been 12. I wasn't exactly paying attention to every detail. Night came fast. By 5 o'clock, it was fully dark outside, and the wind had picked up. It made this low moaning sound as it moved through the trees, and every so often the cabin would creak in response. I heated up some soup on the camp stove I'd brought, ate standing by the wood stove for warmth, and tried not to think about how isolated I was. The nearest neighbor was probably 6 kilometers away. No cell service, no power lines, just me and the forest. I was getting ready to unroll my sleeping bag when I heard it, a voice outside calling my name, Aaron. Clear as anything, a man's voice, deep and rough. It sounded like it was coming from the trees west of the cabin, maybe 30 meters out. I froze with the sleeping bag half unrolled in my hands. My first thought was that someone else had driven up, maybe another hunter who knew Garrett, someone coming to check on the place. But I hadn't heard an engine, hadn't seen headlights. Aaron. There it was again, same tone, same inflection, and then I recognized it. It was my Uncle Garrett's voice. My mouth went dry. I dropped the sleeping bag and moved to the window, pressing my face close to the glass. The fire behind me reflected in the pane, making it hard to see outside. But past my own reflection, I could make out the trees, black shapes against the snow. The wind moved through them, nothing else. Aaron, come out here. Closer now, maybe 20 meters. I stepped back from the window. My heart was doing this thing where it felt like it was beating in my throat. I told myself it was impossible. Garrett was dead. I'd been to his funeral. This was someone playing a trick, or maybe just the wind, or... I need to show you something, Aaron. The voice was right outside the cabin now, right outside the door. I stood in the middle of the room, every muscle locked. The fire crackled behind me. Wind rattled the window frames, and then I heard footsteps in the snow, slow, crunching steps moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Circling, they stopped at the east window, the one beside the wood stove. I couldn't move, couldn't look, but in the glass I saw a shape, a silhouette standing just outside, pressed close, tall, too tall. The proportions weren't right. Shoulders too narrow, head too small for the height. Come outside, the voice said, still Garrett's voice, but flatter now, no warmth in it. I want to show you what I found. I finally moved. I grabbed my truck keys off the table and went straight for the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latch, but I got it open and stumbled out into the snow. The cold hit me like a fist. I wasn't wearing my coat, didn't care. I ran for the truck, my boots slipping in the powder, and hauled myself into the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God. I threw it into reverse and backed away from the cabin, my headlights swinging across the trees. For just a second, they illuminated something standing at the tree line, pale, impossibly thin, arms hanging too long, and then I was turning, accelerating down the forestry road, fishtailing in the snow. I drove straight through the night, didn't stop until I hit Rocky Mountain House an hour later. My hands had gone numb from cold, my fingers white and stiff on the wheel. I sold the cabin through the lawyer without ever going back. Someone bought it in March. I hope they're okay out there. I hope they don't hear voices they recognize calling from the trees, but sometimes late at night, I wonder what Garrett found in those woods, what he saw that made him carve those symbols into the wall, and I wonder if it's still out there, still calling names in voices it shouldn't have. Story 2. The thing about ice fishing on Cold Lake is that you're never really alone, even when you think you are. There are always other people somewhere on the ice, little clusters of shacks scattered across kilometers of frozen water, smoke rising from their stovepipes, the sound of augers drilling new holes. But in February of last year, I managed to find a spot where I couldn't see anyone else. Just me, my tent, and about 800 meters of ice in every direction. I'd driven up from Edmonton on a Thursday. My girlfriend was mad at me for going, said I was using fishing as an excuse to avoid her family, but that wasn't really it. I just needed quiet, needed to sit in one place and not think for a while. Cold Lake in winter gave me that. I set up my tent around noon, right in the middle of nothing. The ice was nearly a meter thick according to the locals I talked to in town, solid and safe. I drilled my hole, set up my heater, arranged my gear. The tent was small, just big enough for a chair and my tackle box, but the propane heater made it almost comfortable. Outside, the wind scraped across the lake surface, picking up loose snow and sending it skittering past in waves. The fish weren't biting much. I'd been out there 3 hours and only caught 2 small perch when I started to notice the scratching. It was faint at first. I thought maybe it was my line rubbing against the edge of the ice hole or wind catching the tent fabric. But it kept going, steady, rhythmic scratching like fingernails on wood. It seemed to be coming from below. I leaned forward and looked down into the hole. The water was dark, almost black, and I couldn't see more than a few centimeters down. My line disappeared into that darkness. The scratching continued. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch or something caught under the ice, moving with the current. Cold Lake was deep, over 70 meters in some spots. Anything could be down there. By 4 o'clock, the light was fading and I still hadn't caught anything worth keeping. I was getting ready to pack up when my line went tight. Not the quick jerk of a fish striking, more like something had grabbed the line and pulled slowly, steadily, testing the weight. I gave it some slack, then set the hook. Whatever was on the other end pulled back hard, too hard. The line cut into my gloved fingers as I tried to reel it in. It felt less like a fish fighting and more like I'd hooked something solid that was slowly moving upward. For almost 10 minutes, I worked the line. My arms were burning. The thing on the other end never thrashed, never tried to run, just this constant heavy pressure rising through the water. And the whole time, that scratching sound continued below the tent, louder now. When whatever I'd hooked finally reached the hole, I saw it. Not a fish. An arm, pale gray and slender, rising up through the black water. The skin looked wrong, too smooth, almost waxy. And there were no nails on the fingers, just flat, rounded tips. I dropped the line. The arm hung there for a second, suspended in the hole, water dripping from the wrist. Then it reached out and pressed its palm flat against the underside of the ice beside the opening. The fingers spread wide. I heard more scratching then all around me, surrounding the tent, not from one source but dozens. Like something was crawling along under the ice, scraping at the frozen surface, looking for a way through. I didn't grab my gear, didn't even turn off the heater. I just unzipped the tent and ran. The ice was slick with blown snow and I went down twice, my knees cracking hard against the frozen surface. Behind me I could hear it, that scratching spreading out in all directions, keeping pace. I didn't look back. I just got up and kept running toward where I'd left my truck, maybe 400 meters away. The scratching followed me halfway across the lake. Then it stopped. I made it to shore, climbed into my truck, and sat there shaking for 20 minutes before I could get the key in the ignition. When I finally looked back at the ice, I could see my tent still standing where I'd left it, smoke rising from the stovepipe. Nothing else. No movement, no tracks in the snow except my own. I drove south and didn't stop until I was back in the city. I never went back for my gear, never called anyone to report what I'd seen. Who would believe it? But 3 weeks later, I saw something on the news. They'd found ice fishing gear abandoned on Cold Lake, tent still set up, heater still running, no sign of the owner. The story said local authorities were investigating. They interviewed a few people, showed pictures of the tent. It was my tent, my heater, my gear, but I'd left that stuff in February. This was March. Someone or something had set it all up again, put it back exactly where I'd had it. And I keep wondering if they're waiting for me to come back. A story 3. I was working forestry inventory that winter, which meant spending 10-hour days walking transects through the bush north of Grand Prairie, counting trees and measuring diameter at breast height. The work was cold, boring and paid just enough to be worth it. My partner was a woman named Sienna Volkov who'd been doing this kind of work for 6 years and didn't talk much. That was fine with me. We'd been assigned a section up near the Kakwa River, old-growth boreal forest that the company wanted assessed before they decided whether to harvest it. The area was remote. We had to use a forestry access road that hadn't been maintained in years, and even then, we had to hike in about 3 kilometers from where we could park the truck. It was our 4th day in that section when we found the trail, not an animal trail. This was deliberately cut, maybe a meter wide, winding through the trees in a direction that didn't follow any natural contour. The snow had been cleared from it recently. You could see where branches had been snapped off at waist height, creating this tunnel through the forest. Sienna stopped when she saw it. "That's not on the map," she said. I checked my GPS. She was right. According to our survey data, there shouldn't have been any trails within 2 kilometers of where we were standing. "Maybe hunters," I suggested. She shook her head. "Wrong time of year, and hunters don't clear trails like this." We stood there for a minute, both of us looking down that cleared path. It curved away into the trees, disappearing around a bend about 30 meters in. The light in the forest was flat and gray. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon, but felt later. "We should report it," Sienna said finally. We marked the location and kept working our transect, but I couldn't stop thinking about that trail, who had cut it, and why there in the middle of nowhere. The next day, we came back to the same area to finish our section. The trail was still there, but something about it had changed. It looked wider, and there were marks in the snow along its edges, long, dragged furrows, like someone had been pulling something heavy. Sienna saw them too. "We are reporting this today," she said, "soon as we get back to the truck." We worked faster that morning, both of us wanting to finish and get out. The forest felt different, too quiet. No bird calls, no wind, just our boots crunching in the snow and the sound of our breathing. Around noon, I was taking measurements on a spruce when I looked up and saw someone standing at the edge of the trail. It was maybe 40 meters away, partially hidden behind the trees. A figure in dark clothing, completely still, facing our direction. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. "Sienna," I said quietly. She looked up, saw it too. "Hey," she called out, "you need something." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there. We waited. My heart was starting to beat faster, though I couldn't say exactly why. There was something wrong about the way it was standing, too straight, too still, like a mannequin. "We are working for the Forestry Service," Sienna tried again. "This is a marked survey area." Nothing, and then it moved, not toward us. It turned and walked down the trail deeper into the forest. The movement was smooth, but something about the proportions wasn't right. The stride was too long. "We are leaving," Sienna said. "It's only noon," I started to say. "Now," she said. "We are leaving now." We packed our gear and started hiking back toward the truck. Neither of us said it, but we both kept looking over our shoulders. The forest felt like it was watching us. We were maybe a kilometer from the truck when we found the second trail. This one branched off from our route, cutting through the trees at an angle. It looked exactly like the first one, deliberately cleared, snow packed down, those strange drag marks along the edges. "That wasn't here yesterday," I said. Sienna didn't answer. She was looking at something on the ground. When I moved closer, I saw it, a boot print in the snow, large, deep, but there were no other prints leading up to it, and none leading away. Just that single print, like someone had stepped there and then vanished. "Keep moving," Sienna said. We walked faster. The trees seemed to press in closer, and I started seeing more trails, Or maybe they were the same trail looping back on itself. I couldn't tell. They crisscrossed through the forest in patterns that made no sense, creating this maze of cleared paths that seemed to multiply the longer we walked. When we finally reached the truck, Sienna had her keys out before we even got to the door. We threw our gear in the back and climbed in. She started the engine, and we drove out of there without talking. We reported it that night, told our supervisor about the trails, the figure, the boot print. He said he'd look into it. But 2 days later, when he called back, he said they'd sent another crew to the area and found nothing. No trails, no tracks, just virgin forest. You two probably got turned around, he said. Happens in dense timber. But we didn't get turned around. I know what we saw. And I know those trails were real, because when I got home that night and unpacked my gear, I found something in my jacket pocket that I hadn't put there. A small piece of wood, carved smooth, with symbols scratched into its surface. The same symbols I'd seen marked on trees along those trails. I threw it away. But sometimes I still wonder, if we'd followed that trail, where would it have led? And who was leaving those prints in the snow, one at a time, like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the forest? The story 4. My sister Bryn bought a property outside of Slave Lake in November. 5 acres with a small house and a workshop that the previous owner had used for woodworking. She got it cheap, way cheaper than anything else on the market, and she was excited about having space to do her own woodworking projects. She'd been making furniture for years, and this was finally her chance to have a real setup. I drove up to help her move in the week before Christmas. The property was pretty isolated. Nearest neighbor was almost 2 kilometers down the road, and the house sat back in the trees far enough that you couldn't see the highway. Snow covered everything, about 15 centimeters deep, and the sky had that heavy gray look that promised more. The house was small but solid. The workshop was bigger than I expected, built 20 meters behind the house with good insulation and electrical heating. Bryn was practically vibrating with excitement as she showed me around, pointing out where she'd put her table saw, her workbench, her finishing area. "This is perfect," she kept saying. "This is exactly what I needed." We spent the first day moving boxes in from the truck, setting up furniture, getting the basics organized. By evening, we were both exhausted. Bryn made pasta and we ate sitting on her new couch, looking out the front window at the snow-covered trees. "It's so quiet here," she said. "I love it." I was planning to stay 2 more days to help her get settled, then drive back to Calgary. That first night, I slept in the guest room, basically just a bed and a closet, and I remember waking up once around 3 a.m. and hearing what sounded like someone working in the workshop. I saw running, but it stopped after a few seconds, and I figured I'd been dreaming. The next morning, Bryn was already up when I came downstairs. She looked tired. "Did you use the workshop last night?" she asked. "No, why?" "I thought I heard the table saw running, around 3. We looked at each other, then we went out to the workshop. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The table saw was unplugged, no sawdust on the floor, no sign anyone had been working. Old electrical system," I said. "Probably just pipes settling or something." Bryn nodded, but she didn't look convinced. We spent that day finishing the unpacking, organizing the workshop, setting up Bryn's tools. By late afternoon, everything was basically done. Bryn wanted to try out the table saw, make sure everything was working properly. She fired it up and it ran smooth and quiet. No problems. That night we heard it again, both of us this time. The distinctive whine of the table saw running in the workshop, cutting through wood. Steady, purposeful cuts. We got up and looked out the window. The workshop lights were on. I didn't leave those on, Bryn said. We got dressed and went out. The walk from the house to the workshop felt longer than it should have. Snow had started falling again, small dry flakes that hissed against my jacket. When we got to the workshop door, we could hear the saw running inside. Bryn opened the door. The saw was on, blades spinning, but there was nobody there. The workshop was empty, and there was sawdust on the floor, fresh piles of it beneath the saw, but no wood. Nothing had been cut. Bryn went to the saw and hit the power switch. It shut off. The silence afterward felt huge. Maybe it's on a timer, I said, knowing that made no sense. We checked. No timer, no automatic switches, just a standard on-off button that someone or something would have had to press manually. We went back to the house and neither of us slept much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake thinking I heard the saw starting up again. But the night stayed quiet. The next morning, my last day there, we found something in the workshop that we'd missed the night before. On the workbench, arranged in a neat line, were 7 wooden figures. Small, maybe 15 centimeters tall, carved from what looked like pine. Each one was roughly humanoid but wrong, too many joints in the arms, heads that were elongated and featureless. They looked old, the wood dark and weathered. Those weren't here yesterday, Bryn said. I picked one up. It was heavier than it looked, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Maybe the previous owner left them. We cleaned this entire workshop, Bryn said. Top to bottom, these were not here. We looked at them for a long time. Then Bryn gathered them up and threw them in a garbage bag. I don't care where they came from, they're goings. I left that afternoon. Bryn walked me to my truck and gave me a hug that lasted longer than usual. You'll be okay, I told her. She nodded. But I could see she wasn't sure. She called me 3 days later. I can't stay here, she said. Her voice sounded flat, exhausted. Every night the saw runs. Every morning there are more of those figures. I've thrown them away 4 times and they keep coming back. Get out of there, I told her. I'm packing now. She moved back to Edmonton and put the property up for sale. It took 8 months to find a buyer. When she finally closed on it, she told me the new owner seemed nice. A retired couple looking for a quiet place. I think about them sometimes. I wonder if they hear the saw at night, if they've found the figures. And I wonder what was in that workshop before my sister bought the place. What the previous owner was making there in the dark, and whether he ever really left at all. The story 5. I was staying at the Jasper Park Lodge in early February for a work conference. One of those corporate team-building things that mostly involved drinking in the bar and pretending to care about synergy. The lodge is beautiful, all rustic luxury tucked up against the mountains, but by the 3rd day I was bored out of my mind. When the afternoon sessions were cancelled due to weather, a storm had moved in, heavy snow and high winds, I decided to go for a walk. There are trails all over the property, winding through the pine forest down to Lac Beauvert. The concierge tried to discourage me. Visibility's pretty low out there, she said. Easy to get disoriented. But I'd grown up in Canmore. I knew how to handle winter hiking. I bundled up, grabbed my phone, and headed out. The trail I chose followed the lakeshore before looping back through the trees. It was marked with regular signposts, easy to follow. The snow was coming down steadily but not heavily, and I had good boots. I figured I'd walk for 30 minutes, clear my head, and be back before dinner. The forest was beautiful in that muffled way winter creates, all sound dampened by snow, the trees standing silent and heavy. I passed a couple of other hikers heading back toward the lodge and exchanged nods. Then I was alone. I'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when I realized I didn't recognize where I was. The trail markers had stopped, or I'd missed a turn. I wasn't sure which. The path beneath my feet was still visible, still looked maintained, but something felt off. The trees were denser here, closer together, and the light seemed dimmer, though it was only 4 o'clock. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this far from the main buildings. But the GPS wasn't working either, just a spinning circle where my location should have been. I kept walking, figuring the trail had to loop back eventually, but it didn't. It just kept going deeper into the forest, winding between trees that all looked the same. The snow was getting heavier, starting to obscure the path. That's when I saw the cabin. It was set back from the trail maybe 20 meters, barely visible through the trees. Small log construction, snow piled high on the roof. No lights, no smoke from the chimney. It looked abandoned, but something about it made me stop. There were tracks in the snow leading to the door. Recent tracks. Boot prints heading straight from the trail to the cabin entrance. I should have kept walking, should have turned around and retraced my steps. But I was cold and lost, and the idea of shelter, even temporary, was appealing. Maybe whoever had made those tracks could give me directions. I approached the cabin slowly. The boot prints were strange, deep, heavy, like someone carrying significant weight. But they only went one direction. To the door, nothing coming back out. The door was closed but not latched. I knocked, no answer. "Hello," I called. "Anyone hears?" Silence. I pushed the door open. The interior was one room, small and bare. No furniture except for a wooden chair in the center. No shelves, no stove. The walls were logs, chinked with moss and covered in marks. The same symbol repeated over and over. A circle with radiating lines. Hundreds of them carved deep into the wood. And in the chair sat something wearing a park ranger uniform. I say something because even though it was dressed like a person, sitting like a person, I knew immediately it wasn't one. The proportions were wrong. The arms hung too long, the fingers resting on its knees were too thin, and the head. The head was tilted forward, face hidden, but I could see that the back of the skull was wrong. Misshapen, like the bones had never fused properly. I took a step back. The thing in the chair didn't move. "Sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "Wrong cabin." I backed out through the door, into the snow. My heart was slamming against my ribs. The wind had picked up, pulling at my jacket. I turned and started walking fast down the trail away from the cabin. Behind me, I heard the door close. Then I heard footsteps in the snow, following me. I didn't look back. I just walked faster, then started jogging. The trail curved through the trees and I followed it blindly, branches catching at my jacket. The footsteps behind me kept pace. Heavy, steady, getting closer. I broke into a run. The trail twisted and I went with it, my boots slipping in the fresh snow. I could hear breathing behind me now, deep, rasping breaths that didn't match any human rhythm. And I could hear something else, branches breaking, like whatever was chasing me wasn't staying on the trail anymore. It was cutting through the forest. I ran for what felt like forever, but was probably only minutes. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were going to give out. And then suddenly I burst out of the trees and found myself in the open. Lac Beauvert stretched out in front of me, and beyond it I could see the lights of the lodge. I turned to look back at the forest. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just the trees standing silent in the falling snow. I made it back to the lodge and went straight to my room. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. The next morning, the conference wrapped up, and I drove back to Calgary. But a week later, I was looking through the photos on my phone and found something I didn't remember taking. A picture of the cabin, taken from inside, looking out through the door at the snowy forest. The timestamp said it was taken while I was there. but I never took my phone out, never took any pictures, and in the corner of the image, just barely visible in the shadows, was a hand, long fingers, resting on my shoulder. A story 6. My boyfriend Duncan and I were driving from Edmonton to Fort McMurray in January to visit his parents when we hit black ice on Highway 63. It was around 10 at night, middle of nowhere. Temperature had dropped to -30. The truck spun twice, went into the ditch, and came to rest tilted at an angle with the front end buried in snow. Neither of us was hurt, which was lucky, but the truck wasn't going anywhere. Duncan tried to reverse out, but the wheels just spun uselessly. We were stuck. "I'll call for a tow," I said, pulling out my phone. No signal, of course. Duncan tried his phone, same result. We sat there for a minute, engine running, heater going, both of us doing the math. We passed Fort McMurray maybe 40 kilometers back. Hadn't seen another car in 20 minutes. It was late, cold, and we were in a dead zone for cell service. "Someone will come by eventually," Duncan said. We waited. An hour passed. No cars. The fuel gauge was showing half a tank, but I knew we couldn't run the engine all night. Not in this cold. We'd run out of gas before dawn. "There was a service road back there," Duncan said finally. "About 2 kilometers back. Had one of those forestry signs. Maybe it leads somewhere. Or maybe it leads nowhere and we freeze to death walking," I said. "We can't stay here all night." He was right. We bundled up in everything we had, extra layers, gloves, scarves wrapped around our faces. Duncan grabbed a flashlight from the glove box. Then we climbed out of the truck and started walking. The cold hit like a physical force. My face hurt within seconds, the inside of my nose burning with each breath. The highway stretched away in both directions, empty and white, bordered by dense forest on both sides. Our boots squeaked in the snow. We found the service road right where Duncan remembered. A narrow track leading off into the trees, marked by a weathered Forest Service sign. No lights. No indication of where it went. "This is a terrible idea," I said. "Got a better one." We turned down the service road. The trees closed in immediately, blocking what little moonlight there was. Duncan's flashlight cut a weak beam through the darkness. Our breath formed clouds that froze in the air. I couldn't feel my face anymore. We walked for maybe 20 minutes. The road wound through the forest, climbing slightly. No buildings, no power lines, nothing but trees and snow and that crushing cold. Then Duncan stopped. "You hear that?" I listened. Over the sound of wind in the trees, I could hear something. A rhythmic thumping, like a drum or someone chopping wood. "Maybe someone's out here," Duncan said. "Maybe there's a cabin." We followed the sound. It led us off the service road onto what looked like a snowmobile track, winding between the trees. The thumping got louder, more irregular. Not wood chopping, something else. We came to a clearing and Duncan's flashlight found it. A figure standing in the center of the open space. Tall, wrapped in what looked like canvas or hide, swaying slightly, and it was striking something, its own chest, over and over. The thumping sound came from that impact. Duncan's flashlight beam hit it full on. The figure stopped moving, stopped hitting itself, and slowly, very slowly, it turned to face us. I couldn't make out features. The face was wrapped in strips of cloth or maybe bark, I couldn't tell, but I could see the shape underneath. Wrong. The skull was elongated, the jaw protruding. "We should go," I whispered. Duncan didn't argue. We backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight on the figure. It didn't follow. It just stood there, swaying again, watching us leave. We got back to the service road and started walking fast. Then running. I don't know how long we ran. Long enough that my chest felt like it was going to explode. Long enough that I couldn't feel my feet anymore. When we finally stopped, Gasping, Duncan swept the flashlight around. We were surrounded by trees, the service road was gone. Where, Duncan started to say, then we heard it. Multiple sources this time, that thumping sound coming from different directions, surrounding us, getting closer. Run, I said. We crashed through the forest, branches tearing at our clothes. I couldn't tell which direction we were going, couldn't tell where the thumping was coming from anymore. Everything was just cold and darkness and the sound of our breathing and those drums getting closer. I tripped over something buried in the snow and went down hard. Duncan pulled me up. His flashlight was failing, the beam dimming. There, he said, through the trees I could see light. Distant but definitely light. We ran toward it. It was the highway. We'd somehow circled back. And sitting in the ditch exactly where we'd left it was Duncan's truck, still running, exhaust visible in the cold air. We climbed in and Duncan locked the doors. We sat there shaking, the heater blasting, watching the tree line. Did that happen? I asked. Duncan didn't answer. He was looking at his coat. The back of it was torn, long parallel slashes through the thick fabric, like claws, but he hadn't caught it on any branches. The cuts were clean. A tow truck came by around 2 a.m. The driver got us out of the ditch, and we drove straight through to Fort McMurray. We didn't tell his parents what happened. What would we say? But sometimes I think about that clearing, that figure in the center, wrapped in canvas, striking its own chest. And I wonder what we interrupted, what ritual we stumbled into in the middle of the frozen forest, and whether it followed us back to the highway, watching from the trees as we drove away. A Story 7. The Athabasca Glacier tour was cancelled due to weather, which left me with an entire afternoon free in Jasper with nothing to do. I was traveling alone, a solo trip after ending a 3-year relationship, and I'd been looking forward to the glacier walk as a kind of reset moment. Nature, solitude, all that therapeutic wilderness nonsense. When the tour company called to cancel, I was already at the icefield center. The woman at the desk was apologetic. "The wind's too high," she said. "Not safe on the ice." "What else is there to do around here?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "There's the ghost town, about an hour north. Used to be a coal mining settlement back in the 20s. Nothing much left now, but some people like the history." She gave me directions, a turn-off from the highway, onto what she called more of a track than a road, then a short hike to where the buildings used to be. She said there were a few foundation remains and a cemetery. Sounded depressing, which honestly matched my mood. I drove north. The turnoff was exactly where she'd said, marked by a rusted metal sign that just said mine. The track was barely passable, my rental car bottoming out twice on rocks hidden under the snow. After 20 minutes, I reached a wide spot where I could park. Then I hiked in. The forest here felt different than around Jasper, older, denser. The trees were massive, and their branches filtered the light into this dim gray that made everything look monochrome. Snow crunched under my boots. My breath came out in clouds. The ghost town, when I reached it, was underwhelming. A few piles of rotting logs that might have been building foundations. Rusted tin scattered in the snow. One partial wall still standing, covered in graffiti from people who'd visited over the years. The cemetery was more intact, maybe 20 headstones, most of them tilted, dates ranging from 1923 to 1929. I walked through the cemetery, reading names. Families had been here, kids, people who died young. The isolation must have been crushing. At the far end of the cemetery, set apart from the others, was a grave with no headstone, just a cairn of rocks piled in a rough mound. Someone had spray-painted words on the largest stone, "Do not open." I stood there looking at it for a long time. The paint was faded but still readable. Who writes that on a grave, and who are they warning? I took a photo with my phone, then started to turn away. That's when I noticed the rocks had been moved. Recently, the cairn wasn't intact anymore. Stones had been pulled aside, creating a gap in the mound. And through that gap I could see down into the earth. There was something down there, a wooden crate partially exposed. The wood was old but intact, and I could see metal clasps holding it shut. I should have walked away. Every instinct told me to walk away, but I didn't. I knelt down and looked closer. The clasps weren't locked, just latched. It would be easy to open it. Don't ask me why I did it. Curiosity, stupidity, some self-destructive impulse. I reached down and flipped one clasp open, then the second. Then I lifted the crate lid. Inside was a mask, or something like a mask, made from what looked like pale leather stretched and stitched into a face shape. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth surface with shallow indentations where features should have been. And beneath it was hair. Long, dark hair, too much of it. Like it had been growing inside the crate all these years. I dropped the lid and scrambled back. My heart was racing. The light in the forest seemed dimmer suddenly, colder. I started walking back toward my car, fast at first, then jogging. The trail wound through the trees and I followed it, my breath coming harder. Behind me I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping, snow crunching, but every time I looked back there was nothing. I was maybe halfway back to the car when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Someone running behind me on the trail. I turned. A figure was maybe 50 meters back, moving through the trees, tall, wearing something pale that covered its face and head, running with long, loping strides that covered ground impossibly fast. I ran. The trail was slippery and I went down twice, my hands slamming into the frozen ground. Each time I got up I could hear it getting closer. I could hear breathing, wet, rasping breaths that sounded wrong. When I finally burst out into the clearing where I'd parked, I didn't stop. I ran straight to my car, fumbled my keys, dropped them in the snow, grabbed them, got the door open, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors and started the engine with shaking hands. The figure came out of the trees as I was throwing the car into reverse. It stood at the edge of the clearing, that pale mask thing covering its face, its head tilted as if studying me. The long hair hung down past its shoulders, tangled with leaves and ice. I backed down the track as fast as I dared, branches scraping the sides of the car. When I reached the highway, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just drove. I drove all the way back to Jasper, turned in the rental car early, and got on the first bus to Calgary. I deleted the photo I'd taken of the grave. I don't want to remember what I saw, but sometimes late at night, I think about that mask, about the hair growing inside that crate for almost 100 years, about who was buried there and why someone felt the need to warn people away. And I wonder if closing the crate again made any difference, or if opening it was enough. If something that's been buried that long stays buried once you let the light in. I don't know. I hope I never find out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.